This podcast is part of the Deluxe Edition Network. To find other great shows on the network, head over to deluxeeditionnetwork.com. That's deluxeeditionnetwork.com.
The time is 1998 when John Carpenter took a stab at this gritty vampire western with an adaptation of John Steakley's novel by Don Jacoby. Ever since his parents were murdered by vampires, Jack Crow, played by James Woods, has had one purpose in life: putting stakes through bloodsuckers' hearts. With his battle-hardened crew of mercenary vampire killers and assistants of the Catholic Church, Crow roams the New Mexico desert looking for undead layers to annihilate. But he meets his match when, at a roadside motel, he comes face-to-face with Valak, played by Thomas Ian Griffin, a vampire kingpin possessed of incredible powers who attacks Jack's team and has a main goal to seek out a cross that will give him the power to walk in the daylight. Now Jack and two remaining partners, Anthony Montoya, played
Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert, two titans of cinematic review. Sometimes right, sometimes wrong, but always captivating. Your hosts Antonio of the Cult-Worthy Cinema Podcast and Justin Henson of the Movie Wire are here to take you back to the balcony.
One, I think it's going to be my first, Antonio, where I picked a movie that I actually just can't stand going into it. But the review, I know we kind of tiptoed around this during one of our Oscar specials, and I couldn't not put this in because this is the one review, one episode of Siskel and Ebert that really had Gene under my skin. I talked about it during the special episode where this is one of those adaptions. This is one of those books that really got me to fall in love with the screen adaptation, that really got me interested. I read John Steakley's novel before this movie was even announced, and I fell in love with this book. To this day, it's still one of my favorite vampire books. And this one, day one in the theater, excited to see John Carpenter take on one of my favorite books at that time. And I got to tell you, man, walking out of it, I was pissed. This is one of those that just really got under my skin. And it going in, I was like, how can this go wrong? You have James Woods, you have John Carpenter. All the elements were there. And it was just, to me, one of the biggest letdowns to this day of my childhood.
That's interesting. Yeah, I saw this too in the theater, and maybe I don't hate it as much as you because I don't have a sentimental attachment to the novel, which I have not read. I think this movie's first big cardinal sin is that it came out, 2 years after From Dusk Till Dawn, so it didn't really break any new ground in that territory of like the Western style vampire, like this kind of, Western or Southern fried version of the vampire tale, where our vampires are not sexy, they're not European, they're not Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt. They're down, they're dirty, they're gritty vampires. If I had to pick a world where these things live in, it would be like the same world that Near Dark exists in, or the same world that From Dusk Till Dawn exists in, and this is just another chapter in that. Again, that's just based cinematically. I haven't read the novel. But I don't hate this movie. It's always been one of those ones where I'm like, yeah, it's fine. It's good. It doesn't have a great middle act, but I think it's one of those movies that builds a very fascinating lore in its first act. It builds a lot of great character and a lot of great tension and a lot of great driving points. And in my opinion, a pretty great villain, but it doesn't have enough movie to back up its pretty exciting premise. And that premise is probably what the novel mostly encompasses. So I get what you're saying in the sense of there is a lot to be desired in this movie, but I also don't hate it. And when we did talk about Gene's choice of Memo to the Academy for Best actor pick for James Woods. I think it was like maybe him waxing poetic on just an actor that he likes and a latter day role that he found really entertaining. When we get to the review, it is a really weird one for me because, he's in declining health. His brain is not as fast. His mouth is not as fast as we're used to it being. And you're just seeing a part of him that just really kind of enjoys something for the enjoyment of it. He's kind of taken a step back from his real critical eye that he's used to using. And Roger fully calls him out on it, but we'll get to that in a second. Long story short, I don't love this movie. I don't hate this movie. But what I do like about it has everything to do with the characters and the premise and little to do with the actual filmmaking and storytelling.
So I think we're going to be kind of opposite on this one because here's what I did enjoy. I shouldn't say enjoy. What I approve of this movie is the aesthetics. Yeah, the cinematography, fine. It's all gritty. Like you said, we just got out of From Dusk Till Dawn. So we're not seeing anything fresh that hasn't already been seen in a new direction with this kind of genre. But here's kind of where I really got stale towards this is the performances, the chemistry, it's all stiff. It's all cookie cutter where they move on to one scene after another. They have a conflict, then they have vampires, and they have another conflict, and they have vampires. There's nothing that really stands out when it comes to how these character designs are. And I'm a big James Woods fan. I love James Woods. But he doesn't do anything with this role. He is this macho type that shows no type of vulnerability. And I think that's what this movie really needed is some vulnerability to it. He just, beginning early scene, we see him lose his entire team. That would have been a great opportunity to really kind of dive into this character. And we're going to get into kind of a little bit into the reviews of the portrayal of these characters. But there's nothing new to me that shows a separation from what we've seen in characters in horror movies versus here, because it's so, to me, by the horror book, by the structure of horror films that we get it. We just don't get the teenager cliches that we normally get. It's an adult, straightforward action flick. I hate to call it a horror flick because to me it's not. But there's really nothing new here to me, and there's nothing new with the performances, and especially there's nothing new in the James Woods performance, in my opinion, that he adds to this kind of genre.
I like what you said there because this movie doesn't feel like it should be James Woods. It being a John Carpenter movie and this kind of man on a mission story that is trying to tell, this should have been a Kurt Russell performance. Like, I'm willing to bet that Kurt Russell's name probably even popped up in initial conversations where it just seems too perfect. You've already had him do Snake Plissken. You've already had him do Jack Burton. Like, he is John Carpenter's boy, and this feels like it would have been the perfect role for him. I'd have to dive into that research a little bit more to see if his name was even in the running. But it feels like that is the kind of character that John Carpenter wanted. And in the way the screenplay is written, you're right about the vulnerability. James Woods does not show vulnerability in pretty much any movie that he's in. Instead, he kind of is more of like the Clint Eastwood Heartbreak Ridge type guy in this particular role, where, yeah, he did lose his entire team, but he'll just go get another one. Like, to him, it's all about killing the vampires, the vengeance, the man on a mission stuff. And even like the romantic notion at the beginning with Sheryl Lee's character, Laura Palmer from Twin Peaks, if anyone doesn't know, it doesn't feel sincere. It just feels like it's accessible, right? It's like, oh, you're a pretty girl. I'm a kind of like, loner dude out with my mercenary crew of vampire hunters, and we hang out at hotels and trash them and hang out with hookers every week. Like, that is the aesthetic. So I won't blame James Woods on how he plays that. The way I'm sure he perceived that character, he's playing it to a T. I just don't think that's the way the character is originally written in the book, even though I've never read it. And it doesn't seem like the way that John Carpenter envisioned it either. It almost feels like, to me, and this is completely just my opinion, that the movie got away from Carpenter. I think Carpenter had a very clear vision of what he wanted, but with who he had as the star and maybe budgetary concerns and just how things ended up, it just doesn't feel like a Carpenter movie, even though it has many of the Carpenter tropes, like There's a lot of Carpenter's cinematography that I'm very like comfortable with and familiar with, but it doesn't seem like the right move during the film, right? That's the way I feel. He's doing the score again. I like John Carpenter's score when it's in a very John Carpenter aesthetic, maybe more moody, maybe more visceral, where this is more kind of Western gritty and actiony, and it almost doesn't work. But it's still like, your favorite artist's third or fourth album that no one really likes, but you're still going to listen to it because it's part of the catalog and you respect the artist. That's kind of how I feel about this production.
Yeah, and I agree with the movie getting away from it, because I think when it comes to the adaptation, the written dialogue, it's pretty straightforward to the point of where the direction of the movie wants to go. It wants to be an adult vampire film. And I love that you brought up the score on this, because that's another piece of it where I just don't feel it amplified. It didn't add anything to this. It didn't add to the tension, the danger, the character involvement. When we get into a lot of, especially I will use the example of the final 5 minutes, where this is where music could have really amplified, that score could have really amplified that emotional element, even though it did absolutely nothing to earn the final shot of these two saying goodbye, if you will. So I think there's a lot of missed marks, even on Carpenter's piece of it, is he got pretty comfortable in the way he wants to direct this movie, where he doesn't go outside of his comfort zone. This, to me, isn't the best Carpenter example because he really doesn't stand out. It's one of those movies that if you just kind of watched it for on the surface level and just watched it with knowing nothing, I wouldn't have pinpointed some Carpenter-esque details to it, because it just feels so out of place. And when we get to the script of Jacoby, this is where I think it really does falter, because it's the adaptation is going to be a loosely based on, because it is polar opposite to what the movie is. Because my biggest complaint, and this will be my number one complaint about this movie on how it's written, is there is no added subtext to building chemistry. It's just situation to situation. There is nothing other than this team conversating to really about their next move to really build any, like I said earlier, vulnerability or relationship. There is nothing interesting. And especially going back and doing a rewatch, I think I'm on my third watch on it, is after shutting it off, I had to really reflect on what happened in the middle, because there's not a lot that really happens that really makes me care about what's going to happen during the climax. That's where all these elements just come together and they just don't work to me.
Well, and I think another cardinal sin that it does, and I think it was like an attempt to be daring and twist the audience around, of you bring in such really colorful, salty characters at the very beginning. Like his crew of vampire mercenaries, they're all very interesting people and side characters. You've got Kerry Takawa isn't there? You got Mark Boone Jr., you got Thomas Rosales Jr., from Tremors, but my favorite, Chico, who gets his head blown off at the beginning of Running Man. Like, these are very recognizable genre faces. And the fact that we only get 10 minutes with them and they come in being awesome and then they get slaughtered, spoilers, it does kind of throw you for a loop. And now I knew it was coming, but I remember thinking, man, when I was in the theater, I thought I was going to get like this motley crew of vampire hunters throughout the whole movie. I love side characters. For me, side characters make the movie. My favorite example of this is Twister. Bill Paxton's great. Helen Hunt is great. But I watch it for Dusty. I watch it for everyone in that crew. I watch it for Alan Ruck. Like, everyone in that side character group is what makes the movie for me. This I thought was going to be that, and it's not. You lose those people right away, and then you have to follow the least interesting person of the group, and that's Daniel Baldwin as Anthony Montoya. First of all, that should have been Michael Madsen, 100%. That is who I always think is in this movie, and then I watch it and forget that it's Daniel Baldwin. So, casting parts aside, I think it was a misstep, and maybe that's how the novel works, to introduce such a great cast of side characters and then kill them right away. And then you have to really spend the rest of the movie with James Woods and his mission, which is interesting enough, and he's got the charisma, but you spend way too much time with Daniel Baldwin and Sheryl Lee, and it just kind of drains the energy out of the movie. It makes you not care about the whole Vatican plot with the cardinal and the priest that have run out of the traditional ways of taking out evil and now have to rely on mercenaries. Great concept, totally wasted on a B plot story that just doesn't really go anywhere.
100%. And the first act, when we get all these colorful characters, that's the movie. That's what reminded me, saying they're going to hit a home run with this one, because I loved spending time with these characters in the little amount of time that I had. And I love the idea of where I think they're going to go with it. And then it's just a middle finger the rest of the movie. So,
Right.
And Daniel Baldwin, I think this is the overall message to kind of what I think we're both saying, is that this is a complete miscast of not only the two, but horrible writing that they don't know what to do with. Because Daniel Baldwin, again, wouldn't even be on my 10th choice for this kind of role, because I think he was
Right.
banking off of Mulholland Falls after this one, and hoping that this would be his big break in a John Carpenter film. But this one, I think these are the bottom of the barrel when it comes to the casting choices that would do this based on the written material that was presented with the John Carpenter name. So, but to me, this one is going to be one of those movies that led to my biggest disappointment. Is it sets the bar on a high note with all these characters, like you said, and then it gives us absolutely nothing for the payoff, and we have to sit there and watch the two most unlikable characters go through it. And I think this one, I really do hope, and you won't hear this from me very often, is that this one would get a remake and done right, because there is a lot of material here. And that's what drives me nuts with the adaptions like this, is that they have the answers right in front of them and they can't see it. And this one has pages upon pages of chemistry, of likability, and they couldn't even take the most likable things from this and put it to screen. And it is one of the most sloppiest pieces of work. And let's take the adaptation out of it. It just a holistic as a vampire movie, I think, is just so safe and so generic. And that's something that our critics aren't really going to bring up, is how generic this is. They just kind of liked it for some very strange other reasons.
Well, and it's interesting that From Dusk Till Dawn, it did kind of get poo-pooed by Gene, and this is a sloppier version of it. I mean, it even has the same special effects artist. It has K&B. So the effects and the gore and the dismemberments that they speak about, well, they look exactly like the ones in From Dusk Till Dawn, because you've got the same creative forces behind it. I'm not going to say that John Carpenter fell to the depths of latter-day career hackery, but he did kind of have 3 strikes out, in my opinion, with these last 3 films of the 90s. He had Escape from LA, then he had this, and then he had Ghosts of Mars. And Ghosts of Mars is campy enough to be somewhat fun, but it's not on my gotta see list. It's not on my gotta watch this list. This one, at least I was interested enough to go back and revisit it. I was able to get the Blu-ray for very little money on Mercari, and I'm glad I did, because there's a lot of good extra features, and it was a beautiful transfer, probably the best I've ever seen since the theater. So there are some things to this one that I really, really do like. But yeah, as a film, it just kind of suffers. Mostly because I think of Daniel Baldwin and Sheryl Lee. I mean, she was great as Laura Palmer, but she doesn't really do much for this character. The stakes that those two have, the fact that, it's trying to force this like Romeo and Juliet kind of story with the two of them throughout this movie, it feels so just needlessly shoved down our throats, where we really want to spend time with Jack Crow and Father Adam. Like, those are the two guys we want to follow. I mean, that had almost the makings of like a buddy cop movie, right? You've got like the salty mercenary, you got the man of God, and they're out fighting vampires. Give me 70 more minutes of that and less of this, oh my God, I've been bitten by this girl, and our pursuit into the death and decrepitude of being a vampire is going to bring us closer together. I didn't care.
Well, they take the relationship completely out of it, because they don't even do anything with it. They hint around it quite a bit. And there's nothing that really goes all in on that relationship that drove me nuts, because I would roll my eyes every time we would get those two on screen, because I know by the last 30 minutes, it's not going to go anywhere. So why even put it in? Just take it out. It's just filler at that point. And you're 100% right with Father Adam and him. The chemistry we get within that last act, that's a hint of what could have been, just like what I spoke to in the beginning, and you did too with those characters. It's like the beginning and the end have these hints of what could have been. And Father Adam, I think, was written too little. We should have seen more of that, because we see a progression from him that I really wanted more. I wanted to see that evolution of that character just become a complete badass. And this is a movie of just dropping teases of that. We see it when he decides to go into that room by himself, trying to hunt by himself. We see some development starting to spawn, but we don't, again, go all in. It's so safe. And I think when we get into the reviews, we're going to talk about, yeah, there's some similarities from Dusk Till Dawn, but this one is a lot less gory. It's a lot less sexual. It's a safe vampire movie. And I think this is how our critics really wanted our vampire movies to be, is just so safe and just so Ziploc bagged to the point they just want to see their favorite actors act.
No, this is true. And I think about this more where you got like a man on a mission versus monster or supernatural force. And this was kind of a trend in the 90s. It was like the same year, I think, that, what's that movie? Deep Rising with Treat Williams, where, you know, they're essentially pirates. Essentially, it's like Firefly, but on the open seas of the future, where they're going to pilfer the cruise liner, except it's been taken over by creatures from the deep. It's camp, it's action, it's fun, it's excitement. It's the only Stephen Sommers movie that I like. And it did exactly what movies like this should do. It should just cherry pick off your interesting characters throughout the movie. So you get some time with them, you get some time for their quips and their jokes and understand them, and then you actually feel like you've suffered a real loss when they are now no longer a part of the movie. And this doesn't do that. Like I said, it's just a sin that everyone was wiped out at the beginning. What it does do is it puts a lot of pressure on James Woods to carry this movie, and you can tell he feels it, because there are scenes in this movie where he is mugging so much for the camera and really putting the emphasis in this character, because he knows that nobody else on set has the energy that he brings. It can be distracting. Luckily for him, I like it when he goes into that mode. And this is the next part I want to talk about, where this is why I think Gene really recommended him for the memo to the Academy of Best Actor, is that it's not as much the performance as the fact that he is literally carrying this movie on his shoulders. And if he liked the movie, if he enjoyed what it did, most of that is because of what James Woods brought to the project. I'm going to honestly say, if it had been Kurt Russell doesn't have that energy to carry the movie. He would have just kept on being Kurt Russell. I think I would have liked it less. So I will give Gene the benefit of the doubt of saying, like, look, this movie only does work in the ways that it does because of James Woods. Even if you're not a fan of what he does, if you did not have that energy, the movie would be flat. So that's where I will kind of play devil's advocate with Gene's opinion.
I would agree if there was an award for most valuable player in a movie, but
right. That's exactly what it is, man. Best actor is a stretch, but most valuable, right? Yeah, agreed.
So I get it. And it's hard, because it's very hard for me to look at a movie or review a movie and see somebody that I admire on screen and say, you are making complete trash. You're better than this. And it's one of those, if you're going to win an Oscar, you have to at least cry during the movie at some point. But the emotional stakes, part of the best actor would be showing your range. We don't see a range here. We don't see an up and down. And I get the portrayal of what he envisions this being, the macho tough guy. He's not going to break. His team's dead. His family's dead from vampires. He's had a rough life. We need that substance. if the dialogue's not going to deliver it, we have to see it in behavior. We have to see it in the betrayal, body language, eye contact. Even when he's hugging Daniel Baldwin at the end, there's not an emotional element to that to say he's going to lose another one and he knows he's going to have to put an end to it. There's a lot of things that actors can do to really overcome horrible writing. And to me, I just don't see the attempt there. And that pains me to say it for Woods. When the smarter choice would be with somebody that has an on-screen likability that we wouldn't expect. Somebody that doesn't always play the nice guy. I love your vision of who that would play, because he has the on-screen likability to really kind of carry that feeling of following that performance along. James Woods doesn't have that. He has that undercover cop. He has that macho guy. And we're not going to buy into that character. When he's killing vampires, absolutely, I'll buy into that. But when it comes to actually human connection, not going to happen. And I know we're talking about more chemistry and human connection in a vampire action horror, whatever you want to call this movie. But this movie needed it, because otherwise it's boring. It doesn't challenge the emotional element. It doesn't challenge why we want to follow these characters. And that's what drives me nuts. It's my frustration, my word vomit coming out in just frustration of the Woods character. It's there on the plate of him just taking off with this movie. But I can see where you're going, where he's carrying this movie. But to me, my favorite is Father Adam. To me, that's why I think that was a missed opportunity, because I think he could have outshined James Woods in this movie if given the shot. But again, his name doesn't look good on a movie poster.
And no, it doesn't. Well, and then it makes me also think that, like, it should have Jack Crow's character been more stoic. I don't know how it is in the novel. You know, if he's more stoic, he's more of just like a man of action, less man of words. Where in this one, he's more of like a wisecracking wise guy. Like you said, the tough cop character. It really makes me think. So watching the Blu-ray special features on the Shout Factory Blu-ray, something interesting came up that I didn't know about. That since I guess the novel had been around for a while, this had floated around Hollywood for a minute before John Carpenter picked it up. It was almost produced by Vestron for a direct-to-video movie that would have been directed by Russell McKahee of Highlander fame, with Dolph Lundgren as Jack Crow. Now, I like those Vestron direct-to-video movies enough because they're campy fun, and I don't know the source material a lot, but there is something about that idea of like having a more stoic character, and since it's Dolph Lundgren, they would definitely make him stoic since he can't speak very well. You know, we don't want the whole Masters of the Universe debacle. But I think it would make for like a more moody and visceral film that I think the source material originally was supposed to be. Like, this does feel like a very outlandish movie, but it doesn't feel like an outlandish story. It feels more Western/Southern Gothic, which is why I compare it to Near Dark. Like, that was the first vampire film that really made me feel like, oh, vampires aren't necessarily sexy. They're dirty. They sleep in the dirt. They travel around in like this dusty, shaded up caravan, right? They're not living in mansions, or they're not, you know, living in the Abbey, like all those different tropes that we're used to. So I do like that, but we don't get enough of it in this. And yeah, it does feel like a misfire. I'll give you that 100%. And I can see why you are so disappointed in it, because of how great you say the source material is. And I take your word for it 100%.
Yeah. And I don't know about Lundgren being the Jack Crow character, because I think he'll burn in the sun within about 5 minutes on it. So, but I do think he'd add almost a cartoonish fun element to it. And the book does have that. And the one thing that the book does have that, again, we spoke to, is a vulnerability piece of it. So Jack Crow isn't this macho man. He does have slight vulnerability in the beginning of the book. But I think Dolph Lundgren, they would have gone even more over the top cartoonish with it. So I think that would be a fun idea, but I think it would also been the complete polar contrast to what we got, and no meeting in the middle.
Maybe, because his Frank Castle is actually pretty stoic.
It's
the
true.
Movie is goofy, but his Frank Castle is pretty stoic. But then also, I was like, well, maybe if he played Father Adam, but then I can't forget that he was also like the crazy preacher hitman in Johnny Mnemonic. So I don't know. Versatility is not Lundgren's game, but damn it, he tries. So let's go ahead and start playing some of these reviews. This was Gene's to introduce. And I mean, you'll hear it right off the bat how much he really enjoyed this movie.
James Woods leads a team of vampire slayers in the exciting new picture from the director of the horror classic Halloween, who has so many admirers of that film and its success that he now gets his name in the title of the pictures he makes. So this one is technically called John Carpenter's Vampires. And it's so exciting, it should only enhance his reputation as a horror director. Of course, it helps to have James Woods on your team when you want to make a high-energy movie, as the vampire hunter faces off against a vampire master, the evil Valak, who controls a nest of bloodsuckers.
So one of the things I think is really interesting about his comparison is we all know, at least we should, if we're fans of Gene Siskel, that one of his favorite movies of all time was Halloween. Like, he did talk really poorly about other John Carpenter movies since then, but if there's the two movies I always recognize Gene Siskel of being a fan of, it's Halloween and Saturday Night Fever. Like, those are two movies that he just kind of held on a very special pedestal. What's funny to me is that if there's any John Carpenter movie that this is the closest to, it's Big Trouble in Little China. It's got that same energy and vibe, and he hated Big Trouble in Little China. So it's an interesting way that he's doing that comparison, but he finds this exciting, and it's the excitement of the movie and James Woods that makes him very admirable of what it's trying to do. We've talked about consistency and contradiction so much on this show because it really is. Like, if you watch enough of these episodes, you really see the true line of inconsistency and contradiction of their opinions and thoughts. But I also think that's just part of being a critic. And as you get older and you watch more movies and your personality changes, whether with its age or money and success and stuff like that, I think your tastes change. I think your viewpoint and appreciation of movies and what you thought was art and entertainment may actually mature or decrease over time. And as we're getting to the latter days of Gene's career as a critic and his life, unfortunately, we did see him be a lot more lenient and excitable about pictures that if it had been 10 years earlier, he wouldn't have given the time of day to.
100%. And it's hard to pick, even though how much I hated this movie, it's hard to pick apart Gene's review on this because, like you said, it's an evolution of your taste, but at the same time, it's how the mood you're in walking into that theater too, the day you're having. So your mental state, whatever it may be. And this could be just reminiscent to Halloween of him really feeling good about what he saw. He found a connection from how he felt with Halloween. I don't know the only thing I'll disagree is I don't know what he found exciting in this movie because that was his biggest forte in verbiage when he gave this review. And that is the exact opposite of how I felt. I found it completely bored beyond belief. So to me, I think this is where he's really kind of getting a nostalgic feel where he has that John Carpenter slow burn, that non-necessarily gory horror, but that just overall subtle horror that he's seeing. Because like in the beginning, I said, I don't consider this a horror movie, but it's a vampire movie. And if we know Gene, he doesn't like a lot of gore. He doesn't like a lot of loud booms in horror movies. He likes straightforward horror movies that really does excite him. So to me, it's hard to pick apart this, especially coming to the end of his life in this review that we talked about in our special. It's hard to kind of pick apart this movie on it. And it's almost hard for me to say you're 100% wrong on this, Gene. I disagree. Everything you said just is opposite of how I think anybody would view this movie. But to me, I think it's an honorable review and it's a pleasure to see him get excited about it. But to me, I can't see it.
I also kind of think that with the excitability he has for James Woods, it makes me want to go back and like see what other films he reviewed of James Woods, because I've seen a few, but they don't stick to the top of my mind. But there are a lot of James Woods performances, especially like in lead roles, that he never really took off as like a real star of his own movie. He was most memorable in like side pieces. He's great in Salvador. My favorite performance of his is in the movie Split Image. I'm not sure if you've seen that one, where Michael O'Keefe is sucked into this cult led by Peter Fonda. And it's like one of those, hippy dippy cults, but it actually is very sinister. And James Woods is a guy that they pay to kidnap people from cults and then deprogram them. And the deprogramming scenes are so disturbing because he is just so violent and vile, but it's just his way of deprogramming. That's when I really think he shines, is when he, does play a despicable character. So I want to go back and look at those reviews of performances where I'm more accustomed to him, or being like the tough guy in what's the movie with Michael J. Fox where he is the cop and he's training him. I always forget that one. The Hard Way. I like him in that kind of role too. That's the role that we definitely recognize him for. But it makes me want to go back and watch some of those to see if he has the same excitement for his performance in those as he does in this one.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that James was, as he progressed in his career, he started gaining his forte with Ghost of Mississippi. I mean, that's when he really honestly started to get noticed on serious roles. Mm-hmm. So I think when it comes to James Woods, I think he got the wrong roles to an extent early in his career.
That.
So
I'll agree with that 100%.
A lot of his late 90s stuff, that's when we've really started to see and engage with the characters that he plays. So if only we can do a reversal.
I'm telling you, he's the best part of Scary Movie 2.
100%.
All right, they continue.
All of the vampires and their hunters are portrayed by adult actors who play the situation seriously. So, no haunted high schools, no giggling, no drinking beer in the cars, no skinny dipping in the local lake. All this helps make John Carpenter's Vampires a rousing entertainment. It is properly rated R for rough language and scenes of intense bloody violence and dismemberment. But I enjoyed it within that context and give it thumbs up.
So I also think that you have to think about the time this movie comes out in. This is 1998, and we are in the depths of the Kevin Williamson, too smart for their own good, teenagers getting slaughtered genre, right? You've got your Scream movies, you've got Disturbing Behavior, you've got Teaching Mrs. Tingle, The Faculty, I Know What You Did Last Summer. We are balls deep in that era of horror. And these guys had to watch all those and all of their shameful knockoffs on repeat. Every single month, there was a new teenage slasher movie, Valentine, Urban Legend. This is just that era. So I can see how a mature feeling horror film where you don't have a bunch of dumb teenagers who know too many big words are getting slaughtered in the most ridiculous ways. It might feel like a breath of fresh air for him, and that might be one of the reasons why he liked it, because he was probably sick of all the stuff that was just filling the cinemas in the late 90s.
Well, that is a vampire movie. You show it like an old folks home because there's really nothing big that happens. So nothing to get the blood pressure going. So I think that to him, this is tame. And I think you're right, is we went into complete overload of a lot of this. I don't want to call them all junk because I did enjoy a lot of them. But there was...
Oh, that was our generation.
Yeah. But I think for him, absolutely, this is a vampire movie meant for that generation going into the theater. And it almost kind of spoke to him that this was meant for them, where it's not too extremely graphic. There's no teenagers, no drinking. There's no, don't walk through that door. He's there. A loud noise. I'm going to walk through that door. So there's a lot of stuff to appeal to that of not only their age, but at the same time, movie experts that know exactly what they like at this point in their life. So I can understand that point of view on it. But again, I'm still going to linger on that exciting. It is not exciting.
I'm not giving it a thumbs up, although I share your delight that it's not another teeny bopper movie. Right. I mean, getting so tired, really, of teenage vampires. But on the other hand, this intriguing idea, which is that the church has given up on holy water and crucifixes and priests and prayer and just hires mercenaries now to winch these guys out into the sunlight and machine gun them and watch them go up in flames. That could have, I think, been dealt with a little bit more instead of just being the window dressing in a movie that is essentially just a shooting gallery in which you get, one scene after another of vampires and their hunters being hacked to pieces, shot, and dismembered and so forth.
In interesting ways. For example, we haven't seen self-immolation lately. I don't think this year, have we? When they get out in the daylight.
Is this a job for adults? Two of us deciding, how long has it been since we've seen self-immolation in the movies? They all look like they have Roman candles in their pockets.
Somebody did a little research, I guess, and they found some new gimmicks. And and it works. Plus, you've got James Woods spouting off.
Well,
he jacks up this picture so that it never lags.
So Roger makes a lot of good points. He does. Like the window dressing aspect is, the short version of what we've been saying in the last 40 minutes. The idea that there's an amazing premise here, but the premise is not living up to what could have been. Instead, the movie wastes the premise on what just seems like a lot of exposition and filler that doesn't really have a point. And I think when he's saying shooting gallery, he's not talking about like just shooting scenes. He's talking about we're setting up useless exposition just to create the next scene of action. That's it. We're just repeating that cycle, rinse, repeat all the way until the end. There really is no middle act conflict other than the fact that we get more of these, masters show up and this weird romantic thing between Daniel Baldwin and Sheryl Lee that just isn't interesting enough to be worth our time. So it does feel like a hollow middle, which means the end doesn't feel rewarding enough. Like if you're going to be hollow in the middle, wow us with the end. And it doesn't really do that. In fact, I feel like the end is really kind of sloppy and thrown together, where the first part of the movie seems very well orchestrated in its production and its shooting and its performance, where I almost feel like they really had to stitch a lot of shots together just to make the last act comprehensible.
Yeah, 100%. And Roger makes, like you said, a fantastic points because it's almost like what I said earlier. It's very structured. You have, in the middle, they try and make the Daniel Baldwin relationship, the conflict, and the conflict between James Wood and Daniel Baldwin finding out. That's a boring conflict for a vampire movie when you have no chemistry between the actors. So to an extent, there is no interesting way these vampires are killed because we've seen it before. It's not like they have a new trick every single time.
Right.
It's just so, like you said, rinse and repeat. That's all it is. And when we get to the ending, it is not earned because it tries to assume that they earned the chemistry. And I think they assumed that based on the Daniel Baldwin relationship that they've gotten to that point to really push that emotional element, but it means absolutely jack shit. Because if you, again, haven't read the book, I'm not going to spoil it, but that's a payoff. This is where they could have taken this just tiny element and elevated this, because that would have been a much tighter ending when it comes to how our characters climax. Because when it comes to Crow, we don't really get a satisfying climax to it. It almost feels like he's a prop by the end of it because there's no real closure to him other than kind of the cliche walking into the sunset, onto the next job. So there is no satisfaction to any of these characters. It's just like Roger said, it's very structured. There's nothing new that you see an hour into the movie that you didn't see 20 minutes into the movie.
Well, and then Father Adam really just gets his hero moment just kind of washed away. It feels like it's been building up this entire time for him to really have a very strong hero moment. And it's so just unfulfilling. It just really isn't great. And I don't know, Thomas Ian Griffith as Valak, the main bad guy. He's the master vampire. He essentially is getting a way to be able to daywalk, just like in Blade. And he's menacing enough. Like, I'm not saying that he's bad, but there's also like a severe lack of charm there. Like, it's more menace than charm. And I think that you have to at least have a minuscule of charm to make vampire work, right? Like, for example, Lance Henriksen in Near Dark. I mean, he wears essentially like a trash bag over his head so the sun doesn't get him, and he's filthy dirty, and he's just got terrible fingernails and teeth, but there's a seductive charm to him that people are almost lured by. That's the vampire charm. And Thomas Ian Griffith doesn't really have that in this. It's all menace, right? I'm going to say the same thing in Dracula 2000, where we first kind of got introduced to Gerard Butler. We know that he can be charming. We've seen him do it in movies, but he's not charming in that. He's just like menacing and kind of scenery chewing. I don't know if that is a director's problem or an actor's problem. And in my opinion, unless you are a superstar like Tom Cruise, then there is not enough power for you as an actor to say that it's an actor's problem. The director can have a reign over you. I don't really like hearing, oh, it's the director's fault. I'm like, is it really? You know, like sometimes I feel like unless you are in charge of the production, you're just a bad actor and the director doesn't know how to handle you, but he has to get his movie done. So he's just going to deal with it. And that's what this kind of feels like to me.
Yeah. So the only thing I would disagree with that is I don't think Valak should have been charming. I think that wasn't the intent. He's menacing, yes, but this is what I would have liked to see is a battle of wits between Crow and Valak. We have some basic conversations between the two. They know of each other, obviously. He spouts his name and he knows Valak.
Right.
This should have had more screen time between these two to really kind of banter. They're on a treasure hunt to find this cross.
Okay.
So
yeah, I like that.
I mean,
I like that. And again, I'm not familiar enough with the source material to have that kind of framework of like, how intelligent is this guy supposed to be? Because it almost seems to me like Danny Houston in 30 Days of Night, where it's almost just all instinct and animal urges, not as much intelligence. It's just centuries and centuries and centuries of devouring. You know, that's another kind of vampire that you can have. So it's hard for me to say what kind of vampire and what kind of master Valak is. I never felt persuaded enough by Thomas Ian Griffith, and I also never felt frightened enough by him. I felt that it was just a very blasé vampire villain.
he's like a side Marvel villain is what he reminds me of nowadays.
Oh God! And like now, I just thought of Jared Leto as Morbius,
Yes,
and thank you very
you're
much.
welcome.
For that. All right, so they finish it off with this last little like 15 seconds worth of banter.
In some circles, as a guilty pleasure.
Oh, he's getting close to agreeing with me. That means in 2 years you'll come around to my opinion.
We will see in 2 years.
Sadly, we won't see in 2 years because a year later, Gene was passed on. But I don't know, man. You said something last week in the Godzilla episode about if you are on the fence of a movie being a so bad it's good movie or just a bad movie, if you're on the fence, that means that it's bad because there really wasn't enough to push you over to that so bad it's good. I feel Roger's in that position. Like there are things that I think he found entertaining, but there wasn't enough camp and there wasn't enough originality that he was expecting to push him onto Gene's side. He liked the premise. He could see that this could be a guilty pleasure to some after it kind of, you know, got rid of the stigma of being a box office failure, even though it was the most successful John Carpenter movie of like the last 15 years. Like he hadn't had a hit in a while. And this wasn't even a hit. It was just his most, you know, successful one. Yet Gene is all sold in on it. It's a touching moment, honestly, because we all know he wasn't around much longer and he doesn't put up a fight. He just really wants Roger to say, hey, just be on my side and say that this could be a guilty pleasure. This could be someone's favorite movie in a year or two. Like, just give me that. And there's something kind of poignant about it.
It's something sweet about it because the moment he says he's getting close, 2 years, I mean, it's something where the argument is gone from this movie. When if you would have taken it 5 years prior, this would have been an argument.
Yeah, it'd have been salt and vinegar, right?
I mean, Roger gave it 2 stars, which I think, honestly, if I'm being fair, I would have given it because it's just a blah movie. But when it comes to a guilty pleasure from what Gene says in some circles, to me, this doesn't really have the elements of being a guilty pleasure because it just kind of hovers. It's in purgatory of what it wants to be. It plays it too safe. Kind of taking on to the guilty pleasure is it's one of those that really has that fun element almost where it entices you. You have your favorite scene, even in a bad movie. Even in bad movies, you have a favorite scene, and that pushes you to watch it just on that one single scene. When I can't remember 75% of a movie, that means to me it's not going to be a guilty pleasure because it doesn't entice me to see it. This is the type of movie I would watch or flip on if I want to be sung to or lullabied to because it just kind of goes in the same kind of tone in the same kind of pace in a nice setting. That to me doesn't scream guilty pleasure. I can get the same reaction of turning on a fireplace on the TV and falling asleep.
No, I agree with that 100%. I think I gave it 3 stars on Letterboxd. I gave it an extra star because I really like the aesthetic of it and I like the world it exists in. Like I said, I am building a universe in my head that consists of Near Dark, From Dusk Till Dawn, and this film. And not in any particular order. They just exist in the same world. And I like that. I like that this feels familiar because it is very similar aesthetically to 2 films that I really, 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 really enjoy. And it could just be like, the slightly redheaded stepchild of both of those. That's kind of how it feels. And I'll watch it again. I for sure will watch it again. It's just not one I'm like eager to jump back into. But there is a lot in this movie that's worth the experience. There's a lot of great special effects. There's a lot of great lore. I think it's the lore that I like the most, right? Where it feels like John Crow comes from generations of vampire slayers. Like, I want to see maybe 100 years earlier where his great-grandfather invented the crossbow with the winch that they had hooked up to like a horse and carriage. Like, I like that. How funny is this, man? How interesting is that this movie got a sequel, direct-to-video, with John Bon Jovi as like the Crow character, and that at the same time, From Dusk Till Dawn got 2 straight-to-video sequels, and they all kind of exist in the same universe, and they all kind of tell the same story. I don't remember the world being horny for Western vampires in the late 90s. I remember them being horny for teenage slasher films and Final Destination, but people were renting these movies enough for them to get direct-to-video sequels made, and I find that so fascinating. It's just an interesting time we're talking about theaters dying right now because no one's going, even though we got some good movies out. But there was a time where like people were they were going to the movies and they were renting so many movies that people were making video sequels, and those days just don't exist anymore.
Yeah, I mean, the power of a blockbuster or a Hollywood video after a flop hit theaters, because that video rentals swayed whether or not it's going to get a sequel, whether or not it made its budget back, and then video rentals took off, let's take another shot, or the movie just flopped and we had an okay release on videos, let's make that straight to video. I can picture like Vampires being one of those rentals that it's horror, it's fun, it's can be a little campy at a midnight watch on Saturday night with the teenagers or adults. So this one probably did, without knowing the facts, but I can assume this one probably did okay on video rental release to earn those sequels. Same with Dusk Till Dawn. Again, when that came out, it probably wasn't as widely available in theaters as we get a lot of other horror movies. So we can see that in the rental piece as well. But I think with this one, I think this is one that I think is just kind of one that will just float in purgatory when it comes after somebody watches it. I don't know if you've seen the straight to video one, but I'd prefer the sequel to that one over this one, because at least that one has some campiness unintentionally with it, but some campiness to it.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly think that, I know I've seen the reviews on Letterboxd and I've seen the reviews on Amazon. There are a lot of people that like this movie. It's a guilty pleasure, or it's just a movie they like. It's a Shout Factory Collector's Edition Blu-ray, so collectors have it on their shelves. I've got it on my shelf. So there is an audience for this. There is an audience of collectors for this. I just don't think it's going to have a stream of first-time or new watchers of this film. I think when you say purgatory, that's where it is. For one, James Wood's a controversial figure right now politically, right? So that's going to sway a lot of people. The movie's almost 30 years old. That's going to sway a lot of people. And it's a lesser John Carpenter. That's going to sway a lot of people. So unless you are already invested in this IP, I don't think there's much of a resurgence for this film at all.
100%. I think it's unfortunate, and I'll get killed for it, but I hope this one does get a reboot. And if anybody hasn't actually read the book, read the book. It's absolutely incredible.
Shit, give it a series. Make it like a True Blood thing. Put it on HBO or Netflix and make it like an anthology kind of thing. That could be cool.
You got me excited over that comment.
When it comes to the reviews of my critic Gene Siskel, I really, really, really am touched by the amount of emotion he has in his his praise of this movie. It's sincere. Like, he's not being paid by anyone to say these things. He literally had a good time. And you know me, I'm not a critic. I think art's subjective. And this was a moment that he had an enlightening and enjoyable time in a cinematic experience where it's almost like he just turned off his critical brain and just enjoyed the movie. And that works. There are movies that are meant to do that for some people. Like, they don't have to be blockbusters. They don't have to be esoteric. They don't have to be art house cinema. That can literally be something that a person just watched and walked out of the theater and said, I had a great time with that. I like that movie. And that's how he felt. And so since he sincerely displayed that in his review, I'm giving him a B. Because even though I'm not a huge fan of this movie, I love the way he felt about it, especially knowing his track record. And it really got me. So I think it's a solid B.
I think that's fair because he does add a lot of passion to this review. And it's really, you admire that when you actually can not necessarily put in a lot of detailed facts, but you can actually see it on his face and you can see why he is feeling that way and how he's relating to it. I love that. I think it's a great rating. When it comes to Roger, again, not as sweet and not as excited, but he is 100% right. He lays it out for Gene exactly how it is structured, gives them props that it's not teenagers. I wouldn't take that into consideration in a review because it doesn't matter who's in the review as long as it's executed. So I give him a solid 3 stars because he pinpoints everything in a 2-minute basis of what's wrong with this movie to add his dislike. And his written review shows it at 2 stars. It's just kind of linear, stale, 2 stars. So a solid 3 stars for Roger for me.
I like that. And one of the things I did like about his written review is that he really analyzed this movie. It wasn't just like, we know when he's bored with a movie and he'll just essentially write a summary of it and then 2 stars. He has several paragraphs where he actually is like, what I don't understand is if someone gets bitten, if they cauterize the wound immediately, like he's breaking down the science of it, which means to me that he wanted more out of this movie, which means he saw potential. There's a lot of movies he doesn't see potential in and he doesn't give a shit when he's writing his review. He broke down the science and the contradictions enough in his review of it that is just proof that he was interested in the concept and that he was frustrated that the concept didn't pay off to his expectation. So I agree with you. It's a really good written review. I liked it a lot. The
only question I have that I'm going to add with, I really want to know who buried Valak for his hand to pop out of the ground in the beginning. That's my only lingering question.
Oh, see, I think they're like slugs or cicadas, and they just bury themselves and brood, and they pop out whenever they need to feed. That's the way I looked at it. All right. Well, good conversation on that one. So next week, Justin brought a vampire movie, so I had to retort with my own vampire movie, and I am bringing the 80s classic Fright Night. It's one of my favorites. I think it's one of Justin's favorites too, but what do our critics think? That's what it's all about, folks. So tune in next week as we cover Fright Night.
It's one of my favorite 80s go-tos. First, second one, I'm all bought in on Fright Night. I cannot wait for that conversation. That's going to be a great one.
Yeah, I'm excited for it too. So, as always, everybody, like, listen, review, subscribe, give us 5 stars, share it. We are on YouTube. We are on Instagram. We are on Facebook. You can find me on thecultworthy.com. You can find Justin on
themoviewire.com.
And we're going to say it like we say every week. If you are a listener and you want to request a film that Siskel and Ebert reviewed on their show, hit us up in one of our DMs. We've already got another one in the pipe. Josh Scar of Talking Smack suggested Steven Spielberg's Hook. I have no idea your thoughts on that film. I kind of know what Scars are, and I know exactly what my thoughts are on that film. But it'll be fun to see what Siskel and Ebert's thoughts are on that one. So that will be our next listener request, Hook by Steven Spielberg. We want more. Send them to us in our DMs.
I am 100% curious what you're going to think about this because that's one I have not asked you about, but that one, great recommendation from Scar.
Yeah, I guess we'll see. Have a great night, everyone, and we'll see you next week.
See you next week.